Are we ready to begin?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, so hello everyone. We hope you're enjoying the spring and are ready for some fantastic linguistics. I'm Lydia Grabinova and my co-host is Kleanthis Groman, and this is Reflections, which is the talk series where we celebrate generative grammar, specifically syntax, and we're focusing on foundations and developments. And we're doing this by inviting longstanding scholars to reflect on their early work as well as their current perspective. We've now had 10 amazing talks, which you can watch on YouTube. We'll post the link in the chat shortly. And today we're continuing with our 11th talk, which Kleanthis will introduce in a moment. But before that, let me remind you about our plans for next year. Basically, after 3 years of exploring foundations and developments, we decided to change our topic, and it's going to be structure building in syntax and beyond. We have 2 great speakers lined up. We have Chris Collins, who will open this new topic for us with a talk on merge in November, and then Heather Newell will continue with a talk on structuring phonology in, I believe, in January. But before that, we still have 2 exciting talks on foundations. So let us all try to enjoy those as much as possible. And let me mention a few housekeeping matters. If you could please turn on your cameras so we could see your friendly faces. Keep yourselves muted during the talk so that it doesn't, interrupt the flow. And keep your chats in the chat section to the minimum so that it also doesn't distract the speakers and the audience. And with that, it's over to you, Kleanthis.
Okay, great. Big welcome from me as well. Welcome to the Reflections Spring Edition. And of course, a very warm welcome to today's distinguished speaker, Professor Hilda Koopman. Truth be told, we don't really know each other all that well. If memory serves me, well, we only met once. That was at the beginning of this millennium when I visited UCLA around the 2000 Wickford. And UCLA is, of course, where Hilda spent almost all of her rich academic life. Hilda Koopman joined the faculty of UCLA's Department of Linguistics in 1985, where she is now Distinguished Research Professor Emeritus. That means that after landing her first academic job right after a PhD at the University of Tilburg in 1984, she didn't have to move again. Quite amazing. But of course, she was already involved in linguistic research, even as an undergraduate student, if I read that correctly. When you did your undergraduate studies at the University of Amsterdam, where Hilda, of course, also did her MA. Back in that, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, she was a research assistant and later a research associate on a project on the Kru languages that was based at the Université du Québec at Montréal. And Kru languages is, of course, where we know Hilda from for a very, very long time. Hilda has always excelled at both her linguistic lives, that of a theoretical linguist in syntax and morphology, interfaces, working on antisymmetry, locality, and many other issues, and that of a field worker on, and I like that term, and underdescribed languages, such as the aforementioned Kru languages and a dozen other African languages from 8 different families, but also Austronesian and Creole languages as well. Hilda has given numerous keynote and guest lectures, and her list of publications spans 5 decades and is as impressive as it is wide-ranging. Just think of her first book, The Syntax of Verbs, From Verb Movement Rules in the Kru Languages to Universal Grammar, the published version of her doctoral dissertation with Forrest in 1984, or Verbal Complexes with Anna Sabolci, who was here as well, published in 2000 with MIT Press. But of course, Hilda was also part of the very successful multi-author textbook Linguistics, an introduction to linguistic theory, which appeared in its first edition with Blackwell in 2000, and the more recent syntax textbook with Dominique Sportiche and Ed Stabler, an introduction to syntactic analysis and theory, published in 2013 with John Wiley and Sons. Among her many articles, I just mentioned two, both co-authored with Dominique Sportiche, Pronouns, Logical Variables, and Logophoricity in Abe in Linguistic Inquiry from 1989, and the classic The Position of Subjects in Lingua from 1991. Now, today's handout can be found in the chat, and I will repost it in a few minutes for people joining us a little later. And before we start, let me just mention on a related note that the conference series Morphology as Syntax will have its fourth installment this Friday. I will also post the link in the chat. This is relevant because Hilda was involved in organizing MAS 2, the workshop in 2022. So for Friday's meeting, if anybody is interested, it's organized by Stony Brook University and Queen's College CUNY. Registration is required either for Zoom or for an in-person attendance. And now, without further ado, please welcome with Lily and me to Reflections, Professor Hilda Koopman, who will present the recurrent theme of her research on head movement and phrasal movement. Hilda, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. My audio is on. Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction. So I will talk today about kind of the place of head movement and phrasal movement in the grammar. In particular, what I will do is try to trace the history of verb movement in the genitive. Oh, thank you. So I started my career, like Cleanta says. I'm born and raised in the Netherlands. I went to study general linguistics, which was not an undergrad, didn't have an undergrad program at that point, was only a graduate program. So it was a master's program where I studied with Henk van Riemsdijk and Pieter Muisken, who's unfortunately no longer with us. Catherine Snow from the Childers database project, Irene Vogel as a phonologist, and had a fantastic time studying there, because this was the time when GLOW was starting and where people were coming through the department all the time. I remember my first meeting with Jean-Roger Vergniaud in the elevator in the department. It was very exciting to see people up close. So I will, I went from basically being a student in the Netherlands, and I wrote my first syntax paper ever for Henk van Riemsdijk. And Henk van Riemsdijk, I had a meeting with him after the paper, where I had argued that in Haitian Creole, the determiner, that's a final determiner in the noun phrase, actually should be compared to a sea-level projection and played a role like that. So we had a meeting with him, and at that time, everything was on paper. And the comments on the paper were, I came into the meetings and I was kind of shocked because there was all red ink over the paper. And I thought that was a terrible sign that maybe, I had done a terrible job here. And in fact, it turned out that he was very enthusiastic about the ideas and everything. And, he was just pushing me as hard as he could and told me, well, you really should think about going away from the Netherlands, which was a very exciting place for linguists, and going, to study in the States, which I didn't do. But I did go to Canada to work more on Haitian for my MA thesis. At the same time, when I arrived at the department there, Jonathan Kay came back. He's a phonologist and a field worker, came back from local LSA, and basically had decided he wanted to talk about tone. So there was the time for auto-segmental phonology. And there was a student in the department who came from the Ivory Coast. His name is Douablé Simeon. And he was a speaker of Wata, that he wanted to work on his language, which was much too hard for him at that point. And so we started working together, and I learned a lot of field work, you know, kind of how to do field work and how to argue, how to use theory, etc. from Jonathan. And, you know, we had a fantastic time working on the language and discovering this undescribed at that point language in all its beauty. Okay, so I will, that work actually became my work for my PhD thesis. And my career as a field linguist, basically a field worker linguist and a theoretical linguist at the same time. So we actually went on to get money for this project, and it became a huge project in Canada, where we were interested in working with native speaker linguists and forming them as linguists. So many field trips to Africa that we did this time. So this is basically what I will do is I will trace the history of verb movement in the generative framework. And I will, on the most general level, address the question if verb movement, that is head movement in general, should be a distinct process from phrasal movement or not, or and whether it is part of core syntax or not, where actually head movement is operated in, or the phenomena of head movement is handled in the grammar. As we will see, the answer to this question depends really on what we think, where we think linear order is handled in the grammar. Is it part of the core syntax, or is it actually in the externalization component that is in the PF? So what I'll do is I'll divide my reflections on head movement, in particular verb movement and phrasal movement, over several periods, and I'll call it the early head movement theory period, which was basically from when I entered the field and started working on the Kru languages till my dissertation, which circulated in '83 and was defended in '84 in Tilburg. Well, I was actually working in Montreal. And the second period is the kind of the period of the big expansion, or the golden age of lectures of government and binding and principle and parameters and Romance linguistics and people, exploration of the principles and parameters in more and more and more languages, the very exciting period. And then the third period that I will talk about is the period that leads up to today, which is the minimalist program from Chomsky 1905, and which distributed. Sorry, it tells me that there's recording in progress, and so I don't know why it speaks to me, but then there is the period, of course, where distributed morphology and minimalist program both are theories that have narrow syntax, that is, linear order is actually not part of the syntactic component, narrow syntax, and anti-symmetry, where, of course, linear order is completely central to the framework. So my current work, and you'll see I will talk more about anti-symmetry and Memo Tinque's work in the anti-symmetry framework, which I think has been incredibly important and exciting. All right, so my early verb movement work is basically on Vata and Badi, and what we see is that if we look at, I'll show some examples in English, I'm not going to show them in Vata, if you look at clause structure, you see that the first element is in 1A and 1B. The first element is the subject, and there's clearly a subject position. The second element is a verbal element, can be either an auxiliary or an inflected verb, followed by a tense marker, a suffix, or clitic more, and then adverbs and objects and particle and the verb see. where we see that the VPs, the verb shows up in the final position in 1A, but it showed up in the second position in 1B. So we see here that there is a verb which is actually inflected when it is appearing in this position here for aspect. So it has either imperfective or perfective aspect, which is very closely related to the root. We see this little piece of structure appearing in this position here. And alternating with a final position where the inflection is absent. Okay? So this we'll call the verb to I kind of type of movement. And it is very reminiscent, of course, of my native language, Dutch, which has verb second rule. And so what we see here is that this verb to T movement, or the alternation between the final position and the aux position, is very similar in its properties to the Germanic verb second construction, but different in that it seems to target a position which is following the subject and not above the subject. So the landing side is different. And there's a second type of verb movement that I worked on that the language has. And one of these structures is called the predicate cleft construction, or the verb doubling construction. And basically what you see in that construction is the verb is, there are two copies of the verb. There's a verb in the left periphery preceding the subject, and then the rest of the sentence looks just the same. So we see that in this construction, a lexical verb is copied in some ways and appears, or moved and appears in the initial position. So I call this and I'm not going to really talk about this type of movement here. So this is more like an A bar WH type movement, where it targets some left periphery position in left periphery, and has properties that it shares with WH movement constructions or A bar movement constructions in general. So the question here was like, is the landing site in Vata, is it the same as in Dutch? And the answer is clearly not. It is following the subject. So we have now, kind of Germanic languages that are V2C or T2C, and Vata, which is the verb to inflection. And so you can see that this is also different from a verb second kind of construction, in that this applies in all, this movement applies in all finite environments, and it is not a root phenomenon. Therefore, it's not a root phenomenon. So how did this type of movement fit into the theory at that time? All right, so we see there's a lexical verb that comes out of the morphology, which is pre-syntax. Okay, so we take a lexical verb and we build structure, and we see this, the structure here is very shallow. And it's actually very close to traditional phrase structure rules. That is, there is S goes to a subject, an inflex, and VP, and I didn't say anything about the internal structure here. So there's a question of, that was a question at this time, is there a head for this, the S, and is that the inflection or not? So I was not part of the X-bar theory kind of structures, right? It was not integrated. There was ternary branching that I have here, but later I will have binary branching in later chapters when I talk about this. This is for expositional reason. And we see that there is a subject position, which is not a DP, but an NP. So there were no DPs yet in the structure. We haven't, kind of talked about discovered phrase structure in that way. The VP, there's no VP shells, there's no VP internal subject, So all these type of elements that we should add now, they are not part of the theory at the point that I wrote, or they were just starting to get into the theory at the time that I wrote this. But we can still decide, there is this movement, and ask questions about this movement. And the question is this a different type of movement? And we see it is. That is, it is a movement you can only take, it cannot be analyzed as a phrasal movement, because it's part of a phrase, but it doesn't move the entire phrase. Right? So the only way in which we could separate a head from its dependence at that point in the theory was by head, taking the head out and leaving the rest intact. Okay, so the rest could have moved, but it didn't. So this was actually the only way to separate V from its dependent. So it could not be analyzed as phrasal movement. It could not be analyzed as a root type of movement, which we find in the Germanic languages. So it's not language specific. It's not it's not family dependent, and that means that this is part of UG. That's option that you have this type of rules, and then we need to understand how to kind of analyze, how to ask questions about this, and what to do about this. So this is basically kind of the beginning of the head movement theory, which it becomes important. What I basically tried to do is in the dissertation at that point is ask the questions which we should ask, and we still ask, is how does this compare to verbal phrasal movements? Why do you move? And at this point, Chomsky on WH movement and LGB had started, or the field had started to classify different movement transformations into big classes of movement. So A movement and A bar movement, or NP type movement and WH movement. And so basically, I argued that verb movement actually fits into this picture as well. So for raising to subject, so there's no internal subject yet. Landing side is clause internal. An A-type movement, landing type is clause internal. It's strictly local. That follows from principles of the theory, ECP and principle A. And the A-type of verb movement is also the head movement, strictly local. So that also, I argued, can be derived by the ECP, as it was at that point, which basically governed where you could have a licit trace. That's where an extraction site could be. And then there was the question, why would you move? What is the reason you move, right? That question that continues throughout the theory. Well, I asked, you move for case reasons. We know for A movement, you move for case reasons. So there's a case filter, you are born without a case, and you have to satisfy the case filter, so you move to a case position. And the case position is the specifier of the info. So movement was forced by one of these principles that is the case principle. And I argue this is actually the same for the verb movement. That is, this verb movement, what you see is this node, which is actually quite complex, must contain verbal elements. And that's because of case. So that I argued, it becomes a case assigner when it has a lexical verb in it. So it depends on this verb kind of giving this property to the inflex. Anyway, so that was basically what I argued in the paper, in the dissertation. And then the other property is like, in which component does this happen? Where does this happen? Is this part of syntax, or can it be relegated to PF, right? So this question is already there, like what is the division of labor? So what we see, that actually there are kind of consistency in the field of what we can ask, what the questions we ask, but what we can decide depends on how well we understand the syntactic structures that underlie our reasoning, right? That reflect our understanding of the syntax. So basically, I concluded that it had to be in core syntax because it plays a role in licensing case. So it has further effects on the syntax that we want to analyze as syntactic, therefore it had to be syntactic. The landing side plays a role in licensing extraction. Okay, that's what I try to show, that if you do V2C in other language like Spanish, there is a consequence of how far what you can extract. Okay, so it had consequences for the rest of the grammar. So these kind of questions, they come back when we ask questions about linear order in our model. And then the question is, why does it help or halt? So we move still, nothing further extracts. Well, what do we do with the fact that the landing sites can be different in between languages? So that's a kind of a parameter. That's, when you learn a language, this is just something that you have to figure out from the data that you get, the primary data. Now, the fact that it is in a core syntax I argued for that, but there were alternative proposals. There were proposals where the verb movement or head movement was handled in PF. There was a problem of linearization after the syntax and not in the syntax. For example, for verb clusters that you find in Germanic languages. And we see this come back with in Chomsky 1995 in that basically head movement is not part of narrow syntax. Important kind of arguments against this that I'll come back to are given in the appendix by Ora Matuchonsky, where she basically showed that it has to be in for theoretical reasons in the syntax. And of course, the answer to this is given in anti-symmetry. That is basically word order, which verb movement does. It changes the surface word order. It can be shown to interact with syntax. Okay. So other possibilities are, of course, that it is not movement. It doesn't belong to kind of a relation with the movement dependency, but it reflects a different spell-out algorithm altogether, right? So spanning or mirror theory are ways of doing this. So what this work does, actually, what my work did, it helped establish verb movements as an independent movement process in UG. So it's not language specific, not family specifics, but it kind of broadens up the fact that other languages can show you evidence about how Dutch should be analyzed, or what UG should contain. What I didn't address in 1984 was another type of very important head movement constructions. They are called so-called verb raising constructions, where you get a cluster of infinitivals, like in Dutch and German, that are different from V2. They're actually different from V2C type movements. And so the question is, these look like heads, but they can be bigger sized. And it's always been kind of one of the big topics in Dutch syntax has been the analysis of verb clusters. What is kind of interesting from a kind of looking back at this is finding out that this is a huge topic, maybe as big as clitics in Romance languages, like verbal clusters. How do they work? But really dozens of linguists, excellent linguists, working on it. And it actually took, I think, 20 years to discover that verb clusters actually were not a unified phenomenon, but there were two different constructions involved. And so there was one that's called the third construction, called by as such by Hans Broekhuis and Hans den Besse. But the kind of important fact to realize is that, even in a language like Dutch, which is so heavily studied and so many excellent syntacticians, empirical progress is timely. It takes time and patience and a lot of work. Okay, so hopefully when our theory gets better, it gets faster. And I think that's actually true. All right, so this brings me then to the next age. That's basically the golden age of LGB and principles and parameters. It's actually a period of extraordinary progress and development, kind of explosive development. And head movement actually plays a big role in this progress, but so does the incorporation of VP internal subjects, or the comparative syntax angle. In particular, the influence of Romance syntax and the incredibly cast of Italian linguists, Luigi Rizzi, Adriana Baletti, Memo Cinque, etc., Luigi Budio, etc., etc. This, the contributions to the theory have been, immense and continue to be immense. in ever increasing number of languages, more and more languages that can get incorporated. All right, so at this main conclusion of this inciting period is that the empirical landscape is much richer and much more complicated and less amenable to simple clusters of parameters than we initially thought or hoped for. So things are more complicated and messier or more variable than we thought we were expecting. But yet this period produced important empirical results, right? And we shouldn't forget those empirical results, that they are there lasting. Theories change, but they don't change. And so we need to incorporate them in kind of the next stages of development of the theory. So what this theory leads to is it leads to kind of strong decomposition, cartography, and then it leads to the minimalist program and anti-symmetry, basically kind of the period that brings us to now. So a few words on head movement here. So head movement actually played a central role in figuring out universal hierarchies and working out functional structures. These are Travis and Mark Baker, the head movement constraint, which is I had kind of argued it is local because of the ECP, but got kind of called the head movement constraint. Is head movement is strictly local, and what head movement Baker's work in particular did is that it brings in morphology into the realm of syntax with his mirror order principle in 1985, and the head movement constraint in the book Incorporation. It was his dissertation. So what does the mirror order principle says? Because it says something about linear order. It says that if you look at the mirror order, if you look at morphological derivation, the structure of words, morphological derivation that gives you the structure of words must directly reflect syntactic derivations and vice versa. So quick question, what is the status of the mirror order principle today? Does it hold or does it not hold? And the answer to here depends. It depends on how we think words are formed. What is the mechanism by word for word formation? If it is a head movement, well, the mirror principle cannot hold because there are word orders or morpheme orders that the mirror order principle, that head movement cannot derive. Okay, so then we need to say something else about these mirror order, what looks like head movement violations of the mirror order principle. But the different answer is that yes, it holds. But we were wrong about thinking that words are derived by head movement. And there is a way in which you can make this work. If it's actually derived by phrasal movement, then you get expectations that are expected and problems that go away. So actually, from a point of view of morphology as syntax, the term that Chris Collins have coined for the type of morphology I'm involved in, is that they actually, they are part of the syntax. And so if head movement in syntax can be reduced to phrasal movement in syntax, well, then maybe morphological rules also have to be changed to phrasal movement in syntax. Well, that's where I want to go. Okay, so of course there's a huge progress that comes from the increasing number of languages like VP internal subject, the DP hypothesis, etc. So a long list, and I'm not going to talk you through the entire list, but there is just an enormous amount of kind of progress that the field has made empirically and theoretically over this period. So what we find, there's an ever greater inventory of functional heads, and they're specified. They enter into X-bar theory, binary branching, which Keynes' proposal in 1991 first, and published in the 1984 book. I'll tell you an anecdote about a conversation that I had with my good friend and colleague Reineke Bok-Benema, who was a student at the same time as I was. And so we read Conditions of Transformation together and tried to understand what was going on with lots of hard work. Kane gives the lecture, a beautiful lecture at GLOW, and basically talks that structures have to be binary branching, and the double object, you could not have two sisters to a verb, right? So there's no kind of flat VP structure. And I was upset. And so, I said, well, here we change again or something like that. And she actually told me, so I was upset because I was questioned in my belief, right? I was kind of saying, oh, now I have to change my belief about how double object constructions work. Well, of course I had to change that, but I think my first reaction says, I don't want to change that. I want to believe that or something like that. But she told me, she said, well, if Kane says something, you better listen. And so this is a lecture. So and she is totally right. And so sometimes, you are forced to change your position because, it's just wrong and there's a better one. And so you have to be willing to go there. All right. Now, the one thing that happens with this structure is with larger structure, there's more movement, actually. There's more internal merge. There are more options. And there are kind of movements that come into the theory, called remnant movements, that we haven't seen really before or studied before. And there are movements in the languages like, for example, Mike and Kenji, a student who was a student at UCLA, and in his dissertation, he argued for kind of word order alternation, by which in his language, a verb comes in it's a heavily verb initial language. A verb comes last in the sentence, just like in Japanese, and an entire chunk of the sentence precedes it. And he analyzes these cases and so this only happens in negative environment. And he says, but if you move the verb out and then you move the rest to a specifier position, this is what you get. So now we have a big chunk of structure moving leftward, and we have never seen that before in that way, I think. I did a beautiful, kind of analysis of complicated facts in the language. So this kind of fact that you have larger syntactic structures, there's more movement than you're used to, it also undermines kind of this thing about head movement as an independent movement type. Because now, if things vacate VPs or little VPs or smaller structures, how do you know if you have taken the head out or if you have taken a remnant up, right? So it could be that the structure is really like this. This verb that we see sitting by itself is actually in a constituent with a VP and moves to the specifier of some head, functional head. At the same time, we have seen functional heads become, kind of the heads in terms of the X-bar theory. That is, they determine, kind of the properties of the projection as a whole. So basically, too many options in the theory, right? I mean, we are lost. I mean, there's like it goes, govern covert movement, overt movement, so very hard to kind of, so actually the theory left there's too many analytical options available. So we're ready for a new cycle of theoretical development, which is necessary, right? And that happens. But if you have a new cycle of theoretical development, you don't want to lose empirical results that you want to build on. So you're looking for theories that give you, improved empirical coverage. Yes, you get something new out of it and some new questions out of it without kind of new machinery or, things that we need to be able to make back. Actually want to reduce the machinery. And it has to make predictions and lead to new questions, right? So that's what we should ask for every kind of step of the theory or of the work that we are doing. And so here we get to the minimalist program and anti-symmetry. So I'm clearly on the anti-symmetry side. and I can tell you why. And I think it actually has to do with the fact that the minimalist program kind of reduces syntax and kind of say, okay, some of this is not problems of syntax, they have to be dealt with somewhere else. So it's that the idea of it, structure. This, the problem with this is we have too many structures, right? And so this is where there are only kind of meaningful elements in the sense syntax, and it's kind of what you get in distributed morphology. That is phonological meaning, only phonological meaningful elements. They are in PF. So case, theme, vowels, agreement, kind of vowel, etc., are no longer part of the syntactic component, but they are part of a morphological component, which now follows the syntax instead of preceding it. There's always a case where, some of this is completely syntactic. All right. Yeah. Okay, let me move on. How much time do I have left?
You have about half an hour.
Okay. All right. So now we get to kind of more current work. So the minimalist, kind of basic anti-symmetry, which I will call a minimalist theory. It is a minimalist theory because it reduces, reductionist theory, the big progress. But it's fundamentally, it's very different from than the minimalist program, and it actually builds on the discovery of GP and the principle and parameters era. It's so strongly decompositional, and it's not structures that are the problem. It's understanding how things are built is the problem. And of course, linear order in anti-symmetry is completely fundamentally related to hierarchical structure, right? So asymmetric, the LCA says that asymmetric C command maps onto linear precedence. And this has huge consequences, right? So really, it shows that head parameters, is what King shows, is the head parameters makes the wrong predictions. OV and VO are not mirrors, right? And there's a difference in word order actually mean difference in structures. And so one consequence of the anti-symmetry program is that it turns out that human languages are strongly asymmetric, right? And the question is then, how do you derive linear orders from the typology of movements and stuff like that? So what he argues furthermore is that all languages are spec head complement, right? That's the basic kind of structure. Derives that LCA is actually the primitive. X-bar theory is actually not, and derives property of X-bar theory. So right then we go to Phrasal kind of. So basically what this is that there is no directionality parameter, right? And what Kane argues is that actually, if you work this out, there's no new mechanisms that are needed. We already have merge, there's movement, I marked random movement. Things are already implicitly there. And there are things that we seem to need anyway, like silence head. We can't really eliminate those. They are already there. It also has all kinds of analytical kind of consequences that he works out in the book. Rightward movement is, cannot exist in this theory. It's impossible. It needs to be reanalyzed. So it needs to be reanalyzed, and then this reanalysis should give you kind of new improved empirical coverage that he shows over and over in this book, or asks new questions. So it's kind of brilliant. And it's a restrictive theory because it reduces constructions of surface constituent structure to merge. Basically external merge and internal merge, where internal merge is just a question of how big what is the size of something that you move, how do piping works. So this last Kane finishes his book with this beautiful last sentence, which is, to a significant extent, the LCA-based theory of syntax proposed here allows us to have the all too infrequent pleasure of seeing the theory choose the analysis, right? So that's, I think, something that is very desirable, because we have to realize that when we acquire a language, that's the problem that we are dealing with. So we want to have a theory that uses, when we learn a language, it chooses the analysis for us because of the way UG is just structured. I wrote a paper on resultative constructors in Mandarin a couple of years ago. This related to structures. They are resultative constructions. And I actually decided that I would give myself the theory as a guideline and see how far I would go on a language on which I'm not a native speaker, and where I can just use, kind of a starting point of the derivation that was the new thing in there, and then work out Mandarin kind of steps of the Mandarin syntax, and find evidence for each of these steps that I'm postulating. So that's actually, telling you something about kind of the strength of, the theory. If you're able to do that, you take a language and you have a starting point, and then you basically start, deriving how you get to the surface, the linear orders, and you can find support for this at every point. So that's just kind of a very kind of good check on the theory in a sense, and it's a good kind of indication that you're on the right path, so it gives you results. All right, so what I basically have said, head movement, separate movement process continues to erode. And in the joint work that I did with Anna Szabolcsy on verbal complexes, we showed that both verbal complexes in Hungarian, German, and Dutch should be analyzed not in terms of head movement, but in terms of phrasal movement. Okay? So a little anecdote. So Anna, who's here, but we started, so Anna was my colleague, next door colleague at UCLA, so in the office next to me. And Anna at one point talked to me and says, so I'm going to do this seminar next quarter on Hungarian syntax, and I want to talk about head movement and verb movement. And so I think Anna gave me a paper to read, and then we discussed the paper. And then she said, well, why don't you? I said, well, this reminds me a lot. It is a lot of things that are very close to Dutch. And so it looks so similar. So she said, so why don't you tell us about Dutch, how Dutch works? And then what it tells us about Hungarian, how we should analyze this. And so I think Manuel was there actually at this, at the lecture. So we gave a lecture on Dutch syntax, and then we basically started to work together and to try to work out a head movement analysis for verbal complexes, and which we rejected. And then we developed a phrasal analysis instead, which was based on overt remnant movements. It was completely mechanical. There was no economy involved. It was just about, moving things around, and we repeated the same movements and giving you results. And so we developed a phrasal analysis, which removed one type of head movement. And then we tried very, very hard to incorporate the head movement of the V2T type that Hungarian has as well in our analysis. But we failed. We couldn't. Surprisingly, when we tried to incorporate it in this general kind of structures that we had, analyzing movement of a random constituent containing V to specify of T, incorporated beautifully into the mechanic. We didn't have to say anything. So anyone who works on head movement and kind of tries to build it in with what happens elsewhere has a really hard time. But here, I mean, it was just, okay, so that's it, right? So not this structure, but that structure is the one that we need. Okay. All right. So that's basically head movement, you know, as phrasal movements. But now what about the morphology? Well, a lot of things happened in anti-symmetry, right? A huge amount of books by Kane, and a huge amount of work and publications by Cinque. In a series of very important papers and books, you know, and he just continues working out and broadening these ideas. And so what he further reinforces is that their human languages are fundamentally left-right, there's the fundamental left-right asymmetry of human languages. And I call this the generalized universal 20 patterns. And so it starts out in 2005 by looking at Greenberg's universal 20. That is basically how do you order in the world's languages demonstrative, numeral, adjective, noun combinations. And but you see in this universal is that in the pre-head, kind of, if you look in the order pre-head, you find the merge order, right, in the scopal order. If you look post-head, then actually many more orders are tested. And most importantly, some orders are systematically excluded. You don't find them. So out of the 24 hours, orders, there are 14 that are there. So how do we account for that? Well, it could be accidental. It's more interesting to say, well, no, these gaps, they actually are gaps because the system cannot produce them. So how does that work? Well, you have anti-symmetry, you have an independently motivated fixed universal, and then you have different linear orders derived by leftward movement of a phrase that must contain the lexical noun. Now, at that point, a lot of the Romance languages were analyzed as having N to D movement, head movement construction. So this is called phrasal movement. And then unattested patterns, they all violate this fact that you must contain the lexical noun, so it's driven by the noun. And so, for example, you cannot have the two numeral demonstrative adjective noun unless this is a different construction. All right, so you basically find variation within a language is due to the interaction of two different types of parameters. One is the height of movement. How high up in the hierarchy does a subconstituent containing the noun move up, if it does at all? And by piping parameters. So, you know, when you move up, what kind of structure can you take with you? So two types, who's picture and versus who picture of who. And then the interesting fact is that the same patterns and gaps are found all over. Unattested patterns cannot be derived. Okay. Furthermore, Cinque also shows that in 2010, when he revised his analysis in the book on adjectives, that the kind of his earlier analysis in terms of head movement to account for adjective noun and noun adjective orders had to be rethought in terms of phrasal movement. And it's the comparative syntax that gave him this argument, because if you compare the distribution of adjectival projections and their associated semantic and syntactic properties in Romance and Germanic, he shows that in his earlier head movement analysis does not allow you to unify the patterns that you find. So it kind of misses this generalization that there is a unifying property, but phrasal movement around can. All right, so basically now, what does this tell us? So we now have phrasal movement. So what about morphology? Is head movement still playing a role in morphology if the other cases can be reduced to phrasal movements? So now, if morphology is actually completely syntactic, And if head movement is reanalyzed as a phrasal movement, and phrasal movement plays a role in universal 20, then basically we actually should find, if it is in morphology is syntax, we should find the same linear order patterns and gaps as we find in universal 20, given a particular hierarchy, right? So we have to say something about prefixes. So I say they select a complement, no specifier. We have to say something about suffixes in the syntax, give them an EPP property. So there's something that attracts, a verbal constituent or a constituent to its left. And then we make predictions that prefixes should line up in hierarchical order, scopal order before the head. And we find more variability cross-linguistically or within a language in post-head morpheme order, like what you find with universal 20. So if we take a very simple hierarchy, then we find basically there are different alignments possible, where 3 would be lexical category. And we find all of those. And in particular, there's one that we find, which is the kind of the 3-1-2, where the post lexical morphemes line up in the order of merge, in the head complement order. And then there's a gap, so we expect to find cases that are not possible. Right, so where we are there, so basically what we see is that some orders are expected to arise. And in distributed morphology, we would need to say, well, these necessitated lowering in fixation. And some gaps are expected, and distributed morphology makes no such predictions. Very interesting facts about these non-local kind of orders, like this one, is that Paul Kuparski, in a talk that he gave at UCLA in 2013, I think, argued that these are the only cases where you find non-local phonological processes between 3 and 2, right? There's one that intervenes. All right, so now we are at the point where, so this is a program that is ongoing, but we are now kind of at the point where we can ask this question. So, okay, so now we have head movement can be replaced by phrasal movement and remnant movement, and it gives you, even for morphology, the right kind of effects. So you have to go through a lot of case studies to show that this is actually the right type of analysis. So you have to do the syntax work on finding out what the hierarchy is, and how you get the heads in a particular order. So there's a lot of work on each of these individual case studies. But right now, I mean, I think it works. So I haven't been convinced of problems that are unsolvable or cannot be independently motivated. And then it kind of comes to the question about, where is linear order in the syntax, right? So if we can have a theory where linear order is actually driving the syntax, and can be argued that this is actually the case that we should be going in. So what we basically saw is that the distinction between head movement and phrasal movement for verbal complexes that has gradually eroded over the years, but only in frameworks that have strong decomposition and which take linear order to be a property of core grammar. In theories that don't do that, we still have head movement, right? Because that's the only way that we have, or the equivalent of head movement. Okay. So can it be shown that there are reasons that it must be in core grammar, kind of V to T type movements? And that's the last part of my talk today, which I'll talk now about now. Kane gives this argument about the fact that infinitival verb movement, this position of infinitival verbs in Italian or in Romance, actually plays a role in whether you have a complementizer that can combine with an a C, if kind of C element that can combine with an infinitival complement or not. So it has an effect on whether pro is possible. And so, the basic facts that Kane points out is that in those Romance, and this is the argument he makes, he says, this shows that it must be in core grammar. So what you find is Romance languages or Italian varieties differ in whether the infinitive is preceding the object clitic or not. And this correlates with whether a pro is possible, whether you can have an infinitival clause after if. And so this is the Romance languages, they differ, whether they allow C to combine with an infinitival complement or not. And the varieties that allow this are those Romance languages where the infinitive precedes the object clitic. And in order to get the object clitic, the verb preceding it, you have to assume it moves, you have to argue it moves higher, right? So this basically, if a Romance language allows C plus infinitives, then it allows also the infinitive clitic order. And this shows that a movement process, this movement process has no semantic import. It doesn't matter. The syntax of Northern Italian is not interpreted differently from the one of the South is not have not different semantics than the North for this construction. So it must be that it has an effect on somehow an effect on licensing pro. So it interacts with another process, which is clearly something that must be the effect of for syntax. Right. So a second case that I want to discuss is a potentially similar case, might be found in Scandinavian language, where it's well known that if you have object shift, or if you have a negative indefinite, an N word, these are only possible in case where the lexical verb ends up in the verb second position, that it ends up preceding that. So this goes back to Holmberg kind of work, and it has been analyzed as the need for cyclic linearization by Fox and Przetsky. But I think, so this is again a case where you have a negative indefinite that can only be, or a negative word that needs to reach the specifier of negation, and can only do that if the verb, or what I will say is little VP, raises up in front of, below it, right? So I think the problem, and if that's true, then especially for the negative indefinite, these forms only occur in certain specifier position, and verb movement plays a role in those elements being able to reach that position. So this is also even for English. I think Kane argues is the case in his overt versus covert movement. We wrote a paper with Heather Burnett and Sally Tagliamento for the distribution of N-words in Toronto English. And actually what we show in this paper is that if you look at where words like no one or no book can occur in Toronto in kind of this corpus of social linguistic corpus controlled for all kinds of variables, you see that N-words never occur after the lexical verb, and the lexical verb, of course, in English is not as high as T. It doesn't raise as high. So basically, that shows that in the production of kind of speech in that corpus, that we find a Scandinavian pattern that is only in case when there's auxiliaries or their insertion, kind of their constructions, do you get N words. So that Toronto English, that's only really just looks like Scandinavian. And teaching at UCLA, what I found when you try to do Koopman tests with negative words like no one, nothing, that half the class hates something like he reads no books. I don't. That's terrible. It's terrible. So I think there's more to be said about different kind of registers and what happens in different types of cases. Very surprising for me. So a third case that I want to talk about is basically this fact about how PPs are built, right? So we think of PPs as P is a constituent of DP. It comes from traditional grammar, comes from phrase structure grammar. They are base generated constituent, as standardly assumed. But Kane actually says no. This is actually, it's not an underlying constituent. It is actually a bigger. It is constructed in a bigger way. It's not a constituent. It's in and so it's not the input of the syntax, but actually it's built from two separate pages that are put together by iMerge, by movements. And so this is not the input of the syntax of say, a locative adjunct, right, which we're used to, but it's the output of that structure. So basically what you have is you build a VP and you have a locative. The locative raises this DP, raises to a case position. You merge the P, and then what happens is the VP adjoins to the PP, and you get the structure here, right, that we started with, except for the fact that this is at this point this is below where the DP is, and at this point is above, and so we have like a minimality kind of problem that we circumvene, in that this element is not the one that becomes the subject, right? So this is a way in which smuggling works. So there's actually some kind of case of smuggling. So why does the VP move? That's a property of the P that is here, right? So we form a surface constituent structure out of this structure here. So this movement, this VP movement that we have here, well, in Kane's story, the immediate complement cannot move, and so it's the next projection which moves up. Poof, okay, so it does that. And now this VP is just going to end up combining with T in a regular way, right? It's the highest. And this VP movement has no semantic import, right? It doesn't do anything in the semantics, but it has syntactic import in the sense that the subject and the T and the V are now able to reach the positions where they need to be. So it feeds further syntactic derivation. So of course this shakes up beliefs, right? I mean, why would we do this for PPs? But there is very strong empirical support for this analysis that I'll let you read. I mean, over a couple of years, there's enormous kind of empirical reasons, and what you get out of this structure in terms of p-stranding, in terms of scrambling, in terms of PP extraposition, and a host of other type of properties that we don't understand. Okay, so this also kind of brings me to smuggling. So if correct, so this movement actually is very similar to a smuggling kind of movement that Chris Collins proposed for passives, and that they are also, as long as we can argue that these derivations must have these properties, these VPs are in two positions and stuff, we will, these are movements that have no semantic import, but they feed the further syntactic derivation. So that's what passive does, right? It pulls out the big VP and make that the one that is the main verb and get the object close to the subject. Okay, so concluding, is basically that what I'm trying to say is that in theories that where linear order is actually part of the syntax, all movements may turn out to be leftward phrasal movements of various sizes, so there's no need for an independent head movement, and targeting specify position. So I think this is only possible in theory of syntax that is strongly decompositional, and theories that have, like my initial theory of vata doesn't have that property. You can't pull the verb out, right? So you need to have a different mechanism to do that. All right. So I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much. That was perfect timing. Thank you, Hilda.
Thanks, that was great.
Very good review of the history of head movement, which doesn't exist anymore. Okay, so yeah, the floor is open for discussion, questions, comments. Just please indicate yourself. Usually we start with the more junior, early career stage researchers. Don't be shy. Well, while we're waiting for people to ask questions, can I ask a very stupid question, Hilda?
No stupid questions. There are no stupid questions.
So, given the conclusion of what you said towards the end, how do you deal with do support in English WH questions?
Oh, well, so in order to finish this project, right? So this is a stage of the project. I think in order to finish this project, you have to deal with the English auxiliary system, and you have to present an analysis of the English auxiliary system. So from time to time, I come back to this and I make progress. But actually, yeah, I'm not ready to talk about that progress. But I can tell you that I have heard, and I don't know because I don't know if it is a real thing or not. I have heard that someone told me that the reason Chomsky did not want to have head movement in the syntax anymore was he could not work out the English auxiliary system. So I don't know if that's true, but that's what I was told.
Okay.
It's a good strategy, if you can't solve some problem, maybe it's someone else's problem.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. Well, there's the auxiliary system that needs to be addressed.
Yeah,
but
well,
maybe for do support in WH questions at least,
it's not so hard.
You can just drop the assumption that T moves to C, but have it realized in C for whatever reasons. So rather than deriving by movement, derive it independently.
Yeah. So I guess my view about current syntax, or the syntax that I'm involved in, other people, is really to reduce things to merge, and movement is merge. And so you want to have a theory that reduces the properties to things that we need, and we need move. I mean, I merge and emerge.
Okay, so any questions, or have you convinced everybody?
Or lost everyone?
No, I don't think so.
Mm-hmm. Questions?
Yes. No, I only see clapping. That's good. Yes, more clapping and thumbs up. What about questions? Raise your hands.
So I have a question for people.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know if.
There is a question in the chat.
Okay,
so
good.
Before you ask your question,
no, questions first. Yeah.
Here's a question from the chat by Kanji Chang. a very curious question is for languages like Chinese that have WH situations, can we still consider CP to have the plus Q feature? Or perhaps they acquire plus Q in situ?
Yeah, I won't have anything to say about this other than saying that, there might be more movement of this in situ kind of WH phrases than we think there are. Yeah.
Right.
So, the kind of the technical implementation of, how you solve certain type of problems, will always kind of be there. And I think there are different ways in which people have dealt with this, which are perfectly,
Yep.
fine.
Good. Shanti?
I was wondering if you had any thoughts about considering this way of looking at it, where movement is merged and syntax and morphology are the same domain. Do you have anything to say about affix hopping or lowering?
Yeah. So I don't think that there actually is affix hopping or lowering, and I think there's just movements that are to an affix position. So yeah, so I know that in distributed morphology or kind of in the actually a lowering or infixation, and is the kind of mechanism by which people solve problems of word order and stuff like that. And I think they all should be reanalyzed as movement upwards. And it's just then a question of where these particular heads are located, how kind of piping works.
Okay, but so do you expect it to line up with other verb phrasal differences between like English and Italian, for example?
English and
Italian type languages and English type languages where it doesn't seem that you have the same evidence for verb movement, right?
So in Italian, you have a lot of evidence for verb movement.
Yeah.
And so in English, you have a lot of evidence for verb movement for auxiliaries and modals and kind of reconstruction. Yeah, you don't have the same evidence for movement to of the main verb or lexical verbs to T. But yeah, I'm going to reanalyze this as a kind of piping. So it actually. So there's this other thing that has to do with V to T kind of movement that people have been talking about, and so that it doesn't make a difference between, say, languages whether the verb has moved to T or not for semantic properties. But if you think about English, where the verb just seems to be in a lower, hanging out in a lower position in the cinque hierarchy, the lexical verb. And you look at present tense, and you look at a language where the verb is actually much higher in the cinque hierarchy, you see that there's a difference in terms of the interpretation. So, somehow the fact that in English present tense is so like, they eat rice, or it is actually not present tense, but it's habitual. Whereas in a language like Dutch, it is actually present tense, right? So it helps, and it's just John eats rice. He's doing it now, right? So there are these differences in terms of types of interpretation that are related to kind of tense or different kind of aspects that might depend on how high something is. So I know that Rich Campbell, who was a student at UCLA at one point, has a very interesting paper on tense interpretations using kind of the morphology and the mirror order principle to show that there are differences between Germanic and within Germanic, between German and in English in this respect, and then has a kind of a theory of tense that does it. But I don't think So if we don't do the work of trying to find out where the participle is, or where where it is exactly in, the kind of within the cinque hierarchy, which is a very powerful tool to help us understand some of these problems or make them, approachable. We don't really know. Does that answer your question?
So you're basically saying that the present tense S or past tense ED are not necessarily in T. They could be much, much lower.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks.
We don't know. I mean, if you say there's T, well, when you look at the cinque hierarchy, there's
Sure, there's different T's. Yeah. Gotcha.
So it's like.
Okay.
So
Great.
that's the question about the syntax and semantic interface, right? This is.
Craig, please unmute yourself so we can hear you.
There we go. Okay, going back to Cleanda's remarks about English do, I'm not sure how to conceptualize or reconceptualize ordinary verb second, and it might, reconceptualizing might solve an apparent problem, which I've been thinking about lately, which occurs under the traditional analysis, namely, when you move the verb up in German or Dutch, it stays to agreeing with the subject, regardless of where the subject is. In apparently, I say this ironically, well-behaved Bantu languages, some of them, if you move the verb up, okay, into some higher position, and you topicalize in, for example, a specifier of CP, an object, the verb agrees with the topicalized phrase and not with the subject. Okay, and this would seem to be on the surface the normal case because the subject stays way down inside the verb phrase, and so the closest thing for agreement intuitively is the fronted object phrase. And then the question is, in a language like German, where it's been argued that the subject in many cases, indefinite subjects, are very, very low in the structure, possibly in a verbal projection. Nevertheless, there's agreement with the subject, even though you have all sorts of other things intervening, and the object is in the specifier of CP under traditional analysis. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about this, and whether reanalysis in a Kane style framework might offer a solution.
So, yeah, so I mean, I'm not ready to talk about object kind of being. So I don't know if you have, is it the object reversal situation kind of construction you're talking about, where objects agree with the verb? And
Yeah,
argue that the object actually is in a subject position in those cases.
Yeah, that's not sure.
I wanted to say something about triggering agreement. So, the obvious kind of, analysis for Dutch or German, I think, is that this agreement projection, the agreement is triggered quite low. And so it doesn't really matter that the verb moves up after a while. The agreement, given cyclic spell out, the agreement has been, in a lower position in the clause. Now, there is a question.
The agreement would take
with
place
the verb, with the subject. With the subject. So, you would not
agree.
If that agreement is established at a low, so if you have a cyclic spell out kind of theory, and you have an indefinite subject, that indefinite subject is actually agreeing with the verb. In my stories about agreement, that means that the indefinite is in the specifier of an agreement projection, which is very low in the structure. And so your verb gets spelled out within having an agreement, but if it ends up in the C position, it has that agreement.
Mm.
So it's actually not a question about, kind of the higher, the agreement being determined in the highest position in the clause.
So then the question is, what's going on in the Bantu languages?
Yeah. With agreement, yeah. Well, so, one possibility is, I don't know I know about a lot of the language, Bantu languages, where the object actually is in the subject position. It, ends up in being the subject position. I think Urs Lansky has an analysis of these in terms of Scrabble, but I don't really know. I don't really understand the description that you're giving.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, Vicky
but that
Carson,
would be, you have to do it's the analysis is not going to be immediate, right? You have to do the kind of the work and figure out what the hierarchy is. It's hard work. It's
yeah.
It's not
Yeah,
easy.
I mean, her analysis was basically like the traditional analysis, namely that the verb moves up and then the object moves up, and there's no interveners, and so there's agreement.
Yeah. So I think I have a very different, something that I can say about this, I have a very different kind of understanding of verb movement in Romance, in Bantu languages. I think actually in the Bantu languages, the verbal complex raises up as a complex, as a phrase, to a very high position in the clause. So post-verbal subject does not mean it's in the specifier of the VP. It's actually, given universal 20, it's very difficult to see where things are when you follow the head, what the exact structure is.
Exactly.
And so, if you assume that the verb is just, everything lowers on the verb, well, the subject must be VP internal. And then you have a problem, so these should be reanalyzed, right? In terms of the way I'm talking. So there's a question about how you relate VO languages to OV languages. Right? So sometimes people argue in Kenyan structure that nothing moves in the VO language, and that's just wrong, right? So so it is might be the case that you get kind of VO languages by having the VP move up quite high and having everything follows, but it doesn't tell you what that constituent structure after the moved VPs.
Actually, the Kane style reanalysis sort of opens the door completely because you don't know where things are anymore.
Well, still, you do things where things are. You have to work it out. But
Yeah.
you know what the left and right contexts are of each of the heads, right? And that's what you have to work with. So basically, as a native speaker, when you learn a language, you keep track of your specifiers and your complement, the left and the right contexts in which you are.
Exactly.
And so that gives you, where you are sitting. So things don't lower, things, they are at least as high as the pieces that you see.
Yeah.
Good.
So many thanks, by the way, for the talk.
Okay.
Anybody else? Raise your hands. If you don't raise your hands, Hilda has a question for us. Pasha.
I'm afraid of the question from Hilda.
Good.
I guess I have two questions. Thank you for the talk, first of all. One of them is, so under this view of PPs, what happens in degree and, say, result clause extraposition? So for things like too many books have been published recently for me to read them all, right? Because the for clause cannot be at the left edge, right? So it's not, you cannot refer to things like structure preservation that it's an independently motivated move.
So
and how would you derive this kind of
Well, this is a question for Kane, I think. So it's for the four clause, the distribution of four clauses, whether, so if it's on the right, that's going to be derived by having the adjunct on the left. You can only have adjuncts on the left, and then there's a VP, and that must move around. So it must be something like, for blah 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 for it, and then there's a remnant. Then there's the rest of the.
Right, but the problem there is that with your typical PP adjuncts, right, that appear to the left and to the right, they appear to the left, so you independently need a way for them to appear there. For result clauses like these four clauses, they do not appear to the left. You cannot say, for me to be able to read them all, too many books have been published, right? It's out. Or degraded at least.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the one answer might be that, the thing that it is preceding it has, there's something that has attracted it to a higher position. So, you can't get the order where that element. So I don't know. Yeah.
Okay.
Lots of things that's, yeah. For the simple cases of PPs, so I mean, I mean, if you look at the distribution of PPs and scrambling and kind of positions in which you can find PPs, so Kane's analysis is really,
right,
a big step forward. But yeah.
Can I ask about this as well, if we have time?
Yeah, please go ahead.
So with PP adjuncts, when they appear to the right, it's admittedly a lot less studied compared to the left edge. But when they appear to the right, they seem to follow some kind of a scopal order, right? And we do not find as many variations as, right? You typically have something that's VP related and IP related and CP related, right? Roughly, but and it can be derived with this kind of story, but what makes that order so, what makes it appear so stable, right? Why is it that we don't find as many variations as with say the piping orders, right? If all of this is derived, like if all the right order is derived by piping, right? So you have you have one PP adjunct and then the other, right? You're building one KP plus P, then you move your VP, then you're building another KP, PP, and then you move again, right? What determines the size of the second element that moves and why it appears to, I guess, why it appears roughly the same? Why, in other words, why don't we, on the right edge, why don't we find, let's see, discourse level adjuncts closest to the verb? I think I've never seen a language that does that.
I don't know, it looks to me like you should work this out. And see where it leads and what you can say, right? I mean, there's a limited amount of options, but there are options, and kind of see whether what this analysis would be, and what would be the expectations, so of the different types of interacting movements. I don't know. So yeah, I haven't thought about this problem, so I'm not able to do it on the fly. So it's like
I had an off chance that the answer exists somewhere and I just don't know it. Thought I'd ask.
someone else knows. Memo.
You're muted.
Well, I don't have a ready-made answer, but concerning something similar to that you were raising is given by the circumstantial PPs. So depending on the language, you find both, the direct order before the verb. So you get time, place, manner, no other orders. But to the right, it's one of the left-right asymmetry that Hilda was mentioning earlier, that to the right of the verb, you find both. You find it's rarer to have verb, time, place, manner. The usual one is to have, but you have then to take care of focus, which may, even in English, you can, or in Russian, you can move around things because of focalizing, say, the manner, and you put it more to the left and to the right and so on. So I think that one should really look at the kind of linearization that the language has to be able to tell whether, something that you expect to be very high is apparently lower to the right. And to the right, it's always very more complex. I mean, if you take the position to the left, you have no choice. There is just one. And to the right, on the other hand, you do have. And I mean, typically, in final languages, all the PPs are very high. Even in the DP, they are above the demonstrative, even, which seems to suggest that it's really related to the linearization of the language. So, well, I mean, remains all very, vague so far. One should go into the actual cases and see how they can be solved piece by piece, so to speak. I don't know. I stop here because I don't know if it was relevant.
Okay, thank you. Nikos.
Hi, Hilda. So
Hey.
I got disconnected for a moment, so probably someone else might have asked the same question. So I was wondering about the so-called head movement constraint, how one can reconcile this in a system where there is no head movement, if it exists, if the facts are there. So I was wondering if you have any ideas about that.
So bottom up and ordered very strictly, right? So a little bit like what we did with Anna. So the locality comes from, smaller domains.
Thank you.
May add, sorry for intervening once again, but there are cases like Bulgarian where you actually have violations of the apparent head movement constraint, so-called long head movement, which is presumably not head movement, but XP movement by, say, an in-between participle or an in-between auxiliary that moves above the higher auxiliary. That's the so-called long head movement, and Luis Rivero. And I don't know if Greek has anything similar.
No,
Probably not. I don't know. Sorry for.
But the post-verbal, the clitics that go after the imperative, for instance, have been the clitics that follow imperatives in a number of languages where imperatives move very high are possible head movement constraint violations. have been thought as have movement constraint violations.
So I think, I think actually the long head movement cases of Bulgarian and Serbo-Croatian and can be analyzed in terms of verbal complexes and you know, kind of the derivations that you have, which makes them local on the one hand. And on the other hand, I think there is the second position type of move of structures where, you know, you have a clitic that appears in second position, and the element that precedes it can be all kinds of different things, right? And so I think that actually has a different signature. So the way I tend to think about these cases where you have like the second, say, verb or the auxiliary moving up past ahead, and the third one not. You know, so second position clitics, right? So people basically always says for that long head movement cases that there is an element that needs to have a support to its left, and so it lowers after the first word or the first XP to get that support. So I think there are second position types of phenomena which are phenomena that arises from some head having an EPP property that basically says, I need to build a specifier. And what it will do is it will just have the derivation works normally, and then it will just take the closest phrase that it can and move it up. So if you have a sequence of, say, clitics, the clitics are not going to move, but it's the closest XP that's going to precede it. And so I want to kind of have a small chapter on this somewhere, and reanalyze these cases as EPP-driven movements, which are just going to look for the first phrase that you can take, and giving you these violations of you know, the second element, some phrase preceding. And the cases of the long head movement cases where it's to say the infinitive that goes up, so like build, will have, or you know, things of that type. I think they are like the verbal complexes that you find in Hungarian or in Bulgarian and other languages, which are a result of these complex verb formations.
Yeah, we certainly have to jump through a lot of mental hoops to get to visualize the derivations in this framework, which makes it hard to do it on the fly, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, and even I think if I would use the Blackboard, you know, it takes. So there's something that's I was wondering about is, you know, when you want to say that, you know, you should reanalyze certain cases of head movement as phrasal movements, you know, some people don't seem to understand what I mean by that, right? I mean, they just basically, so, and I wonder if you have grown up, so the way we teach syntax, we use head movement because it's so good to do that, because you can talk about differences between languages, and, you know, you can, you know, talk about the structure of the clause. And so you use head movement. And then so people, the first thing that you ever learn has been head movement. Then you say, I have this down. And then you have to rethink that, how that works. And that's like, you know, why would I do that, right? I mean, it's clear that it is there. And it is actually in the minimalist program, you know, and in morphology, it's all over, right? It's all head movement. And so, you know, why would you even think that there would be a problem with head movement? In 1984, I would not think there was a problem with head movement. I thought that, you know, yeah, it was good evidence, right? But that's because my syntax didn't tell me anything else. You know, so the syntax was actually very, very shallow. And we know that's not the way it should be. It's just not.
No, that's right. And there's a lot of traction in recent years, thanks also to Chris Collins' smuggling approach, which has been applied to so many constructions around the languages, around the world's languages. Yeah. Ivona has a question.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm curious about the idea that what we thought is head movement constraint has to do with locality. Because I've been thinking lately quite a bit about what's happening in Haudenosaunee languages like Mohawk or Cayuga, where there is a long-standing intuition that when you create things like complex verbal structures or you do noun incorporation, you're dealing with head movement. But when you do nominal extraposition, you end up with something that looks like phrasal movement. Yeah. At the same time, there's a growing body of evidence that the things that are moving don't have to be just heads, but they can be larger. There's a beautiful paper by Barry and Eric Mathieu on this. And so it seems, so I wonder whether there's a connection between what you just said and these type of patterns that we're just the moment we're looking at more local domains, we tend to think of them as being head movement because it's easier to model it that way. But at the moment we're looking at more non-local movement or movement to edges, we automatically start thinking of it as a phrasal movement because we actually don't quite understand what the diagnostics to distinguish those two type of movements would be once we take your idea seriously. Does it make sense what I said?
Well, I'll have to think about it more. So I think, actually, if you look at Dutch, right, verbal complexes, and what you see in the verbal complexes in kind of contemporary kind of standard Dutch is that these infinitive complexes, they just look small. So they are complements. They are not part. They are, I mean, they are not in the same positions as. They are not adjacent. So they're not in the same constituents as the heads are. But then if you think about, if you look at kind of variation within the, say, within Dutch varieties and, West Flemish, or what you see is that what can appear in these verbal complexes is actually, bigger kind of constituents. So you can have an incorporated particle, or you can have a particle with it, or you can have a noun with it. And these are things that you cannot have in a verb second position. So these are excluded, right, in the second position. So, small class complement, the kind of heads would seem to be part of these structures. And still the complements are not there. So we think of them as being just, heads, right, which kind of have other things incorporated with them that also look like heads. But, you look at, say, West Flemish, and you see these constructions actually can have arguments with them and indefinites and, phrases within them. So it's a bigger constituent. So one conclusion that I kind of reach for those kind of cases is that these are all phrases, and it's the size of the phrase that varies in different, that's the size of the phrase that varies within these different kind of varieties. So you get that by not treating one in one way and the rest in another way, but by having, a small kind of piece of structure, which is actually, a phrase as well, right? So it's not something, it is actually something out of which some elements have been vacated. So the things that, we decide something, head incorporation, then we have a problem because sometimes these heads, they are phrases. And so
exactly.
What I'm saying that, there's a difference between them. It's like, well, phrases come in different sizes. And so there are phrases that, the only thing that you pronounce in them is a head. And so that would be the head movement. So that is kind of the way I would think about these incorporation structures too, where you see that the languages actually do vary in the size of these elements that have been incorporated, right? I mean, they are going to be adjacent or being a constituent with it. And that just shows that, that shows that, kind of not all DPs are born equal. We don't start with, kind of a definite and an indefinite and a bare and kind of small clause, they have different sizes already. So depends on where, at what level we incorporate or we move. So I would, think for that. The interesting question, though, remains about like, do these movements, what do they feed, right? What other syntactic processes do they feed? And I think if you look at smuggling, they feed, or these PPs, these movements that don't contribute to the meaning, they actually feed these word order kind of movements. They feed further syntactic processes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If
Thank
there
you.
are any more
I believe
questions.
Peter had his hand up at some point. Is he still there? Interested in?
Oh yeah, no, it's
Here. Hi.
already been answered, really. Hi. I was just in response to Pasha Koval's question, Hilda had asked, well, does anybody have anything to say about that? But then Memo adequately covered what I was going to say, that post-head you get both orders, pre-head you
Yeah.
right order, and that applies really to PPs more or less, modulo focus, as Professor Chinquay said.
Good.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Well, if there's no more questions, then I guess Lydia can close the session.
Yes.
Yes. There's lots of thank yous. Yes.
Lots of thank yous and lots of
Lots
applause.
of love.
So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Hilda, for a
Thank
great
you all for
talk.
seeing you on my screen. It's very nice to see many of you.
Thank you so much, Hilda. That was great. Thank you.
Great discussion. Thanks to all the participants for the discussion. Let me just announce the next talk. It's Mamoru Saito on Friday, July 3rd. And it's an unusual time. It's 11 a.m., so it's an hour earlier. So for the West Coast, it's even earlier for you. But we had to make this time very specific so that Mamoru is still awake in Japan and we can still all participate. So try not to miss it because it's an hour earlier than usual. And the title is Move Alpha, Free Merge, and Scrambling. So it should be very interesting. And until then, take care.
Right. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.